Yeah, thank you very much. That's terrific. Now I understand your primitive normativity paper. Here's a further description of the case, and I'm wondering whether what I'm saying adds anything or goes into an empty direction, or might be used in order to give to add different kinds of kind of strengths to the skeptical argument. Like I would say, because there are these considerations, of course, spread out all over Wittgenstein, etc. Considerations of something like the following form. I'm thinking of the woodcutters, or let me make up an example. Like a group of people, and they live in a village, and they in this village there are 1,000 cattle. And in another village, there are more cattle. They have never seen more than 1,000 cattle, and they have, and their entire arithmetic is really based on that series from 2 to 1,000. And if you now put a question mark after this, they wouldn't even understand you. So they would neither say 4 to 1,004, nor to they might have no idea.
Yes.
But now, and now I think there would be a quietist move that you could make and add. Well. And there's a practice. Wittgenstein sometimes says context then, and then if you add that context, then so you might just add more information to the picture, because there's a worry with we, like we see that one, and we see, and so there's a community. And it's a very large community for this basic arithmetic, but yes. Some people might not be part of that community, or people who do not have the practice of signposts. So I'm just wondering whether, like adding this context story, like I feel this need to add the context story in order to have your quietism, and I'm wondering how you would think, how this enters my picture, why do you think that, oh no, we don't need that, or...
Yeah, well, I think that what you're quite correctly pointing out is that different things can be different in different cultures. So there are certain minimal conditions that a community has to satisfy. For example, in order to have a practice of using signposts at all, or to have a practice of counting beyond 1,000. And that might make it seem that even in the case of signposts, there is something that's, so to speak, conventional about our use of signposts, or this thing which I'm basically saying, well, this is just a natural intuition, this is an intuition that we all share. And you are pointing rightly to the limits of that. However, I think that it's still the case that there are, even in, so let's imagine a community where they don't count beyond 1,000, or where they don't have a practice of using signposts. Suppose you then were to introduce a practice of using signposts. Can we conceive that these people would start responding to the signposts by going in the opposite direction? I think the thought is no. And that's the kind of intuition which I'm resting on. So similarly, if we were to take these people and we were to show them more cattle, would they then start counting the 1,004, 1,008 direction? No, they wouldn't do that. So even though you do need, there does have to be a practice in order for there to be signposts or using numbers, there's still a tremendous amount that is independent of the particular social conditions and universal across different cultures. And that's what I need to be drawing attention to.
So in a certain sense, is it correct to say that you're making a claim on the metaphysical level too, that then gives you purchase on the epistemological side? The claim is, well, there is a fact of the matter, but the fact of the matter that we mean, this by, etc., lies in the the finite practice, and now you have all sorts of naturalistic moves available. So
I do actually think that you have all sorts of naturalistic moves available once you've got this. So exactly. I think my reply to the skeptic is just supposed to be a first step to block the claim that this moon is blind, once you block the claim that this moon is blind, then you can start saying, well, there are facts.
Yeah, and this is it. And this is why it's not blind. Yeah,
Yes.
now you know it's not blind, and now you can add the other story.
Although I don't want to say in a way that that's why it's not blind. Well, I'm not sure that I want to get into this. If we're in agreement, I'd like to keep it there.
So far we are in agreement.
I don't think I understand your own proposal, but I don't know that I can express my difficulties well. So I'll just say why I don't recognize any need for it, and why specifically I think that your observation of the disanalogy between the signpost and the word is, as far as I understand, not relevant to the answer that McDowell gives. Let me start with this line here on paragraph 2, which is supposed to introduce the problem. There's nothing about your past history to which you can appeal to establish against the skeptic that you meant addition by plus. Conclusion. Knowledge that I mean plus, knowledge that this is how I use the sign, is not knowledge that even it is intelligible to suppose could be based on evidence residing in my past history of using it. That's the conclusion. Now, we may well be amazed and mystified by such a thing, namely that I can be knowing myself to be under a principle of action where this knowledge is not based on any evidence that resides in facts about my past performance. And this is a wonderful thing. Let's think about it further. But I mean, so now this is about myself. Now about the other person. I mean, that's something that also is important in the dialectic. I mean, how can I know that someone else acts according to such a principle? Now, what I think McDowell wants to say, and I think what is perfectly right, is that there can be no step that takes me from an apprehension of his behavior that does not already involve the conception of this behavior through the very principle in question to my notion of him as being bound to this principle. There's an immediate. Now, this is very fundamental. I think you can this has a very elementary first shape, this very thought, which I think is the following. There's no step from the apprehension of another human being, as it were, as non-intentionally conceived, through my understanding of him or her as having claims on me. If you think there is such a step, I think you will. I would take it upon me to show that this will undermine any ethical thought. If you thought there was such there's a very fundamental. Now, how is this to be comprehended? Well, the only way to comprehend it is that the principle of existence of the other human being and the principle of my knowledge of her as a human being is the same, so that her being what she is and my knowing her to be what she is are the same. And this very structure does apply to the signpost. Actually, what's interesting to me, I just heard this, so I want to insist on the disanalogy that you also insisted on. Very fundamental. And I think it's important for Wittgenstein, but I read this. It's quite remarkable that when we see those cave paintings, we can say about them, they show this and that and the other. Now that's amazing. I mean, that's like the signpost. I mean, this is the most fundamental thing we can, and there's nothing that can call this into question. I mean, this is elementary. So this is, I think, a further extension of the thought of my apprehension of human being. Now, this is the basis of language. That's right. But and now there are many languages. Now that's the difference. but the languages retain that very structure. When you write plus, now there's a sign here on the board, you wrote it. Now the fact that plus may, that same lines may, as it were, signify a crucifix, this doesn't mean that the structure of the structure I described about the elementary isn't also exhibited here. Namely, that the principle that explains the reality that's on the board here, and that which explains my apprehension of what's on the board there, including my notion of what's right to write in answer to the question, have the same principle, and therefore no step is needed for me to take from the apprehension of the sign to any understanding of what's right to respond to it. Right? I mean, the fact that I might be fooled in this particular case by your cases like Mama die die die, or I fart. This fact doesn't that would be, I suppose, McDowell's line of reasoning. Yeah. This fact doesn't show that in the case in which I'm not fooled, a bit of disjunctivism, the structure is not the one I described. So I don't see why we can't say, as Wittgenstein says, there is a way of grasping the meaning, which is a different kind of way. Namely, it is to be initiated into the practice. That's what it is to grasp. That is what it is to grasp the meaning. So what you just need to adjust your conception of what it is to grasp the meaning. You don't need to deny that there is such a thing as grasping the meaning.
So you raised an awful lot of points in that. And I'm not sure that I understood everything, but I'm going to pick up on a couple of the points you raised. So one of you started out by talking about the case of other people, which of course I didn't talk about at all. And it certainly is a very important part of McDowell's view that you can respond to another person's claim on you because you can just hear their meaning in their words, and you don't make a step from a conception of the person, so to speak, non-intentionally described as, well, this person made these noises, and then you take a step that goes via interpreting the person as meaning such and such, and then you do what it is that they ask you to do. So they ask you to pass the salt, and without thinking, you pass the salt, and that's because you just hear them as saying, pass the salt. And so well, they say pass the salt. Well, no, wait. They say the words. Yeah. Well, they say the words. I know my being. They say the words. Pass the salt. Yeah. And you just hear that as them saying pass the salt. And so you pass them the salt. And so McDowell wants to say that there could not be a way of getting from. In a way, he's in agreement with Kripke about this, that there could not be a way of getting from them considered brute, non-intentionally just mouthing the words to an understanding of what they're asking you to do. But I'm disagreeing with that because I am making a distinction between hearing the words that somebody utters, as making a claim on you to do something very specific in that instance, and understanding the person as saying something like pass the salt. So I know it's a difficult distinction maybe to get one's mind around, but I really think I want to insist on it. When the person says pass the salt, you, without thinking, you just pass the salt. You do this particular thing, and you recognize the particular thing that you are doing as appropriate to their words. But you can do that, I want to say, without first having recognized them as meaning pass the salt. So the idea of, I'll just say one more thing, the idea of hearing somebody's words as calling for a specific piece of behavior is prior to than, and something that you can have even when you don't have a grasp of those words as meaning something. So a child might get the idea that the appropriate thing to do on leaving is to say bye-bye. Or they might see the mother leave and then they go bye-bye. And it's like they've learned this routine for saying bye-bye when the mother leaves. They recognize that as appropriate, but they don't yet recognize bye-bye as meaning goodbye. So, I mean, that was kind of partly the response to one of the things that you said. And then about the cave paintings, I completely take your point. I think that's like the signpost. But so I was agreeing with everything you were saying, but then you said that languages, they have this structure that we can't deny, and then you said languages retain that structure. But to me, that seems like a dogmatic move. I mean, or at least I want to say something like, well, yeah, they do retain that structure most of the time, but they can easily be made to lose that structure. And the kind of cases that I'm given with the mama, die, and so forth, are being given as ways in which language can lose its structure, and it's because of that that skepticism can arise.
I wanted to abstract from what you want to say about the children. I mean, I don't disagree with it, but I think this question may be left open while we discuss the question how to describe the case of the adult and what to say about them. And I want to say that I do not comprehend why I shouldn't think that. So there's a way of understanding what you said. That's Wittgenstein's way of saying. That is not an act of interpreting, he says, but rather shows itself, is not, but shows itself in, manifests itself in, you're passing the salt upon being asked. Yeah. So that's, I think, now this introduces something that shows itself in, attracts the description, understanding the meaning, is such that knowledge of it does not rest, could not rest, would not make sense to think of it as resting on evidence by past performance, so on and so forth. Now, this is an interesting category, and I don't want to be quietist about it. I want to think about it, right? I see no obstacle I see no reason to stop desiring understanding this thing, right? So even if the children, do whatever they do, I mean, this is what I want to talk about. And one second thing about the sign, you try to, as we're in, get a sense of some weird doubling up of the saying past the salt. So you had some difficulty actually saying it, right? Because you say past the salt, and what do you mean? So you need some. Just the sounds or words or so on. I mean, it strikes me like saying, they're like two things. There's the hand and there's the hand. Try to think, there's the hand, this is human hand, this is a hand you can shake, this is a hand, but then there's also the hand. And now, but I mean, first, metaphysically speaking, it's a hand. Yeah. And I think metaphysically speaking, a plus is, I know what Wittgenstein called a symbol, and that is a use, he says. This doesn't mean past history. Use is the same category that I was sort of after, which does not reside in any number of past instances, right? It's something that shows itself in, but is not any number of those. So it's a use, that's a symbol, that's what it is. Now the question is my apprehension of it as what it is original or not? Yes. And I say, yes, it is. And must be, because actually a symbol is such, I think you said something in response to Jim, because the symbol, as it were, is constituted, the use is constituted as it is through knowledge of it as that use. Again, use, not any use, history of uses.
So there's something that, there's a point on which we're in agreement, which I didn't emphasize in this talk, which is I think that once you've learned a language, and this is precisely what being trained in a language consists in, you no longer need to have the history of the sign in view in order to regard 125 as appropriate to this. It's almost as though, the way that I put it, you probably wouldn't agree with this, but what happens is that the sign comes in a sense to incorporate or stand for or embody its history of use. And for that to happen is for you to become a master of the language. And I think this happens to us all. So we don't ever have to pass the history, or we almost never have to pass the history of our uses in review. But maybe the child does at the very beginning, but we don't. So for us, almost all of the time, 99.9% of the time, it's just the way that you describe it as being. But I want to say that if you get into a situation where you encounter somebody like the skeptic, then you, so to speak, have this move available to you of recalling the previous history and recalling what I call this primitively normative relation between the history and the present use. But we generally don't have to have recourse to it, and generally we do just think of signs as meaningful, and we don't make this separation. But if we're in a situation, sometimes we're in a situation where we are made to make it. And same with the hand, you know, when you see a corpse or something. So in those situations, I'm saying we've got something to say to justify our practice.
Thanks. I'm going to pile on, I'm afraid. I usually find myself, you know, combating both Kripke and McDowell, but your talk did the almost impossible, which has made me sympathize with them by creating a sort of even stronger enemy, I guess. So let me raise a couple of problems in the two main steps of your argument. Your step against McDowell, and then your step against Kripke. And in both cases, I think there are both conceptual problems and problems of, I don't know whether it's how exactly described, but either empirical ignorance or failure of imagination might be unkind ways of putting it. So let me start with the bit against McDowell. I mean, one point, I'm not sure whether Sebastian meant this, but I take this to be the conceptual problem, is that if you were right that the signpost example is less dependent on cultural training or whatnot than the language example, where you can have the same phonemes meaning different things in different languages and so on, that wouldn't tell at all against McDowell's point. I mean, his point is you need training in the linguistic case, the numerical case, or whatnot. How would that tell against that? I mean, it's just a sort of irrelevance. But then the empirical claim, I mean, the claim you make about the universality of these signposts, I mean, that also seems to me so really very problematic. I mean, of course, signposts are the sorts of things we find on roads and and airports and so on. They're created to be international, for one thing.
Yeah.
You know, we deliberately cultivate unified interpretations of them so that tourists don't crash into things and so on. So that's one point. But taking that into account, look at your signpost here, right? I mean, so, you know, we do, of course, in the cultures we're familiar with, most familiar with, read this as pointing that way. Right? Mm-hmm. Why is that? I mean, think about it culturally. Well, it's largely to do with arrows, right? Mm-hmm, we had arrows and we shot them in a certain direction.
Yes.
Right, this point is going that direction. Suppose you're an Aborigine, an Australian Aborigine, and you create a culture of signposts, right? They use boomerangs, right? Yeah. And that looks very like a boomerang, doesn't it? And it would go in that direction, right? You're throwing it in that direction. So I don't even see the disanalogy. I mean, it's a sort of artificial disanalogy. But the conceptual problem is there, even if there is the disanalogy. And then on your answer against Kripke, the conceptual problem there was a kind of slide. You used two formulations. We're justified just on the basis of having had this finite set of examples in making the orthodox move, let's call it, say, to when you've had the sign +2 from 1002 to 1004 rather than to 1006 or whatnot. We're justified in that because what we've seen accords with, you said first, what we then do, and then you said what we then do is called for by it. Now that's a slide. Anybody should allow you the first formulation. The second formulation is the controversial one, right? So I worry you may be trading on that ambiguity, right? That it dictates this answer. Not just that this answer, among maybe an indefinite number of other possible answers, accords with what has gone before. But then think about this proposal that it's just sort of in some way obvious what we're to do at that point. And let me give you an example. So we come to a community. Let's say it's the Trobriand Islands. They don't count very far, right? But they do have, strangely enough, they have our same symbols for the whole numbers. And so they have this term +2, right? It sounds awfully like our term +2, right? So +2, they say. +2. And they've only got a few examples of this, and the kid is given, say 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and in this culture, the person who's supposed to find it so obvious how to continue, here's +2, and he's seen that example identified as a +2 number. That one is a +2 number. That one is a +2 number, and that one is a +2 number. And he or whoever is trying to project on the basis of this limited experience, might very well then, on your story, think he was justified in saying, oh, that's going to be a +2 number, right? But he'd be wrong, because in this culture, in my imagined example, +2 means prime. This is just a phonemic coincidence with our word +2. It means prime number, right? And while these are indeed all prime numbers, that one's not, right? So it's not so obvious. And then if you go to the non-numerical examples, and Wittgenstein is only taking the numerical case as an example, and the same sort of thing is supposed to apply in non-numerical cases, all you have to do in order to see that your story is problematic is to think about words that have a certain overlap in function or application between two languages, but where there's after that departure, variation. Think of the words mind in English, Geist in German, for example. Over a large range of cases, they have the same applications to go. Is this phenomenon or activity a case of mindedness or the mind or whatnot? Yes. Is it a case of Geist? Yes. Over a huge range of cases, they're the same. But then there are divergences. Right? So, for example, mind tends to be more intellectualistic, whereas Geist tends to cover the full range of mental operations, to use the cognate adjective that perhaps has a broader sense in English even. So, or think of education and build on, right? And so on.
What to say?
No, it's just that it's very few points. Yeah. It's just trying to give enough examples so one doesn't miss the points. So build on, for example, again, huge range of similar applications, but then departure. So your proposal for how easy it is to solve Kripke's problem just seems to me hopeless. I mean,
No, I'm sorry. No, these are great points. These are great points, but let me try to respond to some of this let me actually just begin with the last point about Geist and building and education, and then I'll try to work my way back to the other ones. So what seems salient about these examples to me is that we can, I think, actually come to understand the difference between Geist and mind, or at least we can make progress in it. So I think we don't have to worry. Somebody who's been living in Germany for a long time doesn't have to need to worry that all of a sudden somebody is going to start calling a refrigerator Geist. The sort of divergences that there are between the English use of mind and the German use of Geist, they are within bounds, they're kind of comprehensible. And what I'm interested in are the commonalities in our acceptance of what's appropriate, which underlie those possibilities of eventually arriving at agreement and understanding what the other people are doing. So another case that you described was, I know this was in a slightly different context, but you talked about signs being created to be international. And so you said, well, the fact that I say, well, everybody responds to the same signs in the same way, you said, well, that's, first of all, you said that isn't necessarily the case, but you also said, well, that's cheating, really, because these signs were meant to be understood by everyone. But I think what I'm saying is that what I would want to say to that is, we would not have been able to invent signs that were capable of being understood in the same way by everyone if we couldn't rely on the fact that people, that in very fundamental ways people respond to these things in the same way. So I'm not disagreeing with any of your examples, but I'm saying, well, they don't go quite deep enough to convince me that there are the sort of fundamental divergences that Wittgenstein tries to illustrate with this case. So I know that you raised questions both about the criticism of Kripke and, you began, and the criticism of McDowell. Regarding the criticism of McDowell, you began by saying, well, okay, if we allow that the grasp of signposts is less dependent. You said something about McDowell's point being about training. And I think to that I want to say that there is a certain sense in which we don't need training to learn to follow a signpost in this direction rather than that direction. So that's not to say that we don't need some kind of education, acculturation, you can even call it training, to learn to follow a signpost. But once we've been trained to follow signposts, you don't need, or the training to follow signposts doesn't require specific training where the child has to catch on to, well, when you see this, you go this way, you don't go this way, you don't go up, you don't go down. The child doesn't need that kind of specific training that it needs in order to grasp the meanings of signs. I know you've said tons. I haven't responded to it adequately, but...
By the way, that's Wittgenstein's example, not McDowell's.
No, I know. I actually think that... So Wittgenstein says there is only... I think Wittgenstein is wrong about that as well, but I didn't want to get into that.
Again, I think there's a kind of insidious conflation of issues here. You were talking about what it's possible to train kids to do, or what people can cotton on to and so on, that we can understand across the languages, the differences in the practices and so on. It's no part of the Kripke paradox or anything like to deny that. Mm-hmm. That's just another issue entirely. It's as though he was saying we couldn't understand the other practice. That's just not the issue at all. He's trying to create a puzzle about the very foundations for talking that way, and in any other way that imputes a meaning. And I mean, the puzzle, I think, doesn't depend on anything specific about there being, at the end of the day, problems about understanding other ways of doing things. That's nothing.
Yeah. Well, that would be great to talk about this afterwards.
Thanks. So I know we're short on time, right? So, okay, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So it seems like the notion of primitive normativity is really the key to your argument, and I'm very sympathetic to it. I just wanted to raise one possible objection to play devil's advocate. So you want to say that our reactions to objects display a certain kind of appropriateness, and that's where the primitive normativity is coming from. And then you raise this worry at the end that this could be sort of a dogmatic move. And your response is interesting because you say, after raising this question, is this dogmatic? You say no, because I am not faced in ordinary contexts with the question how I should respond. So there is no motivation for questioning my entitlement. So if I understand what you're saying here, the idea is that sort of the space to ask for a justification of one's reactions to objects is not made available within these practices. And so that's how you're trying to close off this further sort of this question of justification. But I wonder if the skeptic could come back and say, just because within the practical engagement there's no room to raise the question, there's no motivation to raise the question whether you are entitled to these kinds of responses, that doesn't necessarily rule out the legitimacy of raising the question of justification. So it made me think of, someone like Spinoza would concede, yes, we view the world teleologically, but that's a big mistake. So we take our reactions as, we take things as calling for certain reactions. We see the world teleologically, but we shouldn't. That's sort of what he's trying to say. So he wouldn't be very happy, I think, with this kind of move. I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
That's actually a form of skepticism, I guess, that Spinoza is defending there. I guess speaking very generally, I think that, and this is a kind of quietist attitude, I think that questions of entitlement always require some kind of background of justification. You're not always at every point entitled to say, well, what's your entitlement for saying that? I think there has to be a framework within which these questions can naturally arise. And so I'm wondering, as well as a framework of a piece of language whereby they can naturally arise, but the skeptic doesn't have free license just to raise them possible.
Thank you.
It does seem to me that the account you give is so abstract that the distinction between what we call ordinary objects and signs doesn't really play a role. I mean, at one point in the handout, you the first line, you seem to describe what it means to correctly respond to a sign, but then you widen the focus and then just go on to talk about finite object, and that seems to me appropriate. The level on which you talk, it doesn't matter whether what we try to understand is our reaction to a signpost or our response to the lamp, the light over there. But if that is true, I wonder whether you are not much closer to McDowell as you yourself think of being, because and I wonder whether the trouble you have with McDowell seems to be a result of reading something into his response, which he actually is eager to undermine, namely that, of course one might wonder, in virtue of what can I understand that I take my recognition of that thing that calls for, normatively calls for the following response, namely not destroy it or use it for lightening the room, as the normatively called for response to that. to take that recognition as something which in the McDowellian account seems, you take McDowell to say that, he wants to say that in virtue of what I can take that to be the normatively called response is in virtue of something else, namely the recognition of the meaning of it, or the meaning in that sense, or its recognition as a lamp, and in virtue of its recognition as a lamp, in virtue of that recognition, I can take my responding to it in such a way as to use it for lightning, as normatively called for. But I think the whole point, that's at least what I think, is to undermine the very idea that these are two distinct acts, that is, the recognition of the meaning on the one hand, and recognition of that thing that normatively calls for the following response, namely use it for lightning. This is otherwise, I mean, it seems to me hard to understand what you think that what does it mean to recognize something as that thing that calls for the following response, namely using it for lightning, if not as that is just identical to recognizing it as being a lamp, as having that meaning. So
look, this is a really good question. Responding to the last part of this, though, the very last part of it, it's really crucial to my view that what you recognize, for example, in the case of the light, is not I ought to use it to recognize for lighting, but I ought to use it for this. So this demands it. So you don't need to construe what you think the object calls for in a way which is already conceptual. So that seems like an important point of clarification. This is what comes out of Kant's aesthetics. I think you see the beautiful object as calling not for some generic response, but as calling for this response, the very response that I have to the beautiful object now. But to characterize in terms of the way that you set it up earlier about my seeming agreement with McDowell, let me just put the way that I understand the disagreement in terms of a slogan. I think that McDowell thinks that our response to the world is always a response to the world as conceptually structured and to the world conceived of as a totality of facts. And so there can only be normative relations between the world and our minds if the world is conceived of as conceptually, propositionally structured, as factual. Whereas I want to say that there's room for the idea of normative relations to the world where the world is not yet conceived conceptually or propositionally or as structured. Another very simple way to put this is that McDowell thinks that all normative relations between the world and our reactions to it have to be rational relations where how things are in the world present us with reasons for our reactions. And I want to say, with Kant and the third critique, no, there's a kind of normativity that doesn't depend on rationality or the recognition of reasons that's more primitive. And that's what I'm trying to get at in my disagreement with McDowell.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for that talk.